If you're just joining us for the first time, this is a weird camera angle. So if no one is going to blame this section if you decide to move, because it just may not be the most attractive view. All right. I'm just going to look into the camera. You all do what you want. It's fine. All right. If you're just joining us, there's too much to catch up on. So in the YouVersion app, there's a couple of videos that you can go home and catch up on what the first chapters were about. But I will say it this way. I know that God exists. I just can't always tell exactly what it is that he wants me to do. Because it seems really unfair, right? Like in the Old Testament, you had a burning bush, and God spoke through this burning bush. That seems pretty clear. There was a pillar of fire, and you got to follow this pillar of fire. That seems pretty clear. In the New Testament age, you had Jesus, and that was obviously very clear. But today, in our resurrection age, it just seems like, what do we have? How do we tell what God wants us to do? I find that if I'm not careful, I sort of drift into this, what I call the idol of our rhythms and our patterns. I kind of just settle into this American lifestyle of privilege, and I call that blessing. Well, I must be doing something because God is blessing me because I live in Montgomery County and in America and etc. But the problem, while God does give general grace, the problem with that is that that's no different than my neighbor who doesn't believe in and follow God. That's no different than my Islamic neighbor who doesn't follow and worship my God. The problem with not paying attention to how God is talking to me, I think it tends to ignore that God is both offering to us and commanding us to do things that have real impact in our everyday lives. Does God exist? What is the obvious way that he communicates with us? What is the book of Esther about? This is where we pick up our story. You remember we just finished Esther, this young woman, and she stands up and she has this moment of faith, and she dives deep into her spiritual roots. She goes way back into her childhood, and she recalls all that her adopted father had taught her, and she's being asked to stand up for her faith. And so she agrees and goes into a 3-day fast, night and day, from food and drink, her and her attendants, and all the Jews of the empire to fast for her as she faces this moment, her defining moment. We pick it up in chapter 5, verse 1. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. Well, that's nice. It just so happens that Esther emerged on her 3rd day. Coincidentally, she chooses 3 days to fast. Coincidentally? Can we consider this? Can we consider that if you're fasting day and night from food and drink, that we can call that kind of a mini death? And so she emerges from her mini death on the 3rd day. Is anyone, as we're hitting Easter, seeing any sort of coincidence? And she also arose, from that mini death, wearing her most royal of dresses. Kind of like how Christ would emerge from the tomb in his most royal, his resurrection body. Coincidence? Probably not. Oh, and last one. Here's one more. She's going to approach the king. And the law of the land was you can't approach the king unless he beckons you, because if you do, well, then you're just put to death because he just can't be bothered with all that. So unless he calls you, don't go. She's going. She hasn't been called yet. And so whereas the king would decide on a whim whether or not to accept this person, we're forced, with the prior two coincidences, to consider that our God, through the life and death and resurrection of our Jesus, always extends to us the scepter of welcome at any time. Coincidence? Probably not. Let's play a little game. I'm a youth pastor, so let's do this. Every time I say coincidence in the form of a question, I might even raise my hand. We'll do a hand cue. Every time I say coincidence, you all answer, probably not. Let's try it. Coincidence? Thank you. Here we go. Look at that verse again. And go behind the text. And think about a young woman. Think about where she was at. She just came out of a 3-day fast, day and night. And this is a young woman used to luxury and softness. She's never had to endure that. How functional would you be? She knows she's facing possible death. She's having to deep dive into a faith that she barely knows or remembers anymore for a people she hasn't seen or been connected to. What is she feeling? What is she thinking? I wish I could have been there. I want to know, how fast was she walking between her palace and the king's palace? And whether she was alone or no, she couldn't have been alone. She had to have had her attendants with her because they were fasting too. And what were they saying to her? Were they walking fast just to get this thing done with, or were they drudging along because they were so tired? She's facing this incredible decision. Like any young person, like any of us, she probably has a lot of negative self-talk yelling at her in her head. What do you think God might be saying to you in counterpoint when you face those situations and you have negative thoughts just yelling at you? And by the way, in chapters 1 and 2, we saw how God used Esther's grace and her beauty and all of her humility for great effect. But now she seems gifted with passion and intent and purpose. She seems she seems gifted in strategy and patience and boldness. And so I ask you, if this young woman can do this, in what way are you gifted? In what way has God blessed you with your personality, with your character traits? What are you leaning on when you go into your battle to face your defining moment? You do not go alone. You do not go unequipped. You do not go ill-equipped. This young woman is our guide. And she has far less than we do. Verse 2. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, beautiful, graceful Queen Esther, when he saw her, he was pleased with her, and he held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request, my favorite? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." By the way, I do a lot of games with the students, and I give away prizes. This is not a prize that is literal. He's not giving away half his kingdom. It's just an idiom. It's a phrase like, "Oh, my child, this morning, you look so wonderful. Ask me for anything. Up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. Here is a bowl of cereal." It's just an idiom. It's just a phrase. But it's meant to express favor. So let's do this. Today we're going to do this. We're going to parse this single event and try to find all of the coincidences, all the things that just happened by luck, by occurrence, just whatever. Let's just see how many we can find. Well, first of all, you have the entire sequence of chapter 1 and 2, which alone have a bank of consequences in each chapter that got Esther to this point. Queen Vashti was deposed, the king was drunk, he did this command, whatever. He held a beauty contest, she won, she's here. And all these things that should not have happened have happened. And now you have Esther uniquely positioned and postured. For whatever reason, no one else could do it. Esther also, coincidentally, managed to keep a posture to her position. Not just that she was queen, but she postured herself such that she kept the king's favor. Because let's think about this for a second. Isn't it far more likely that Esther would have been bitter towards a man who had stolen her and taken her away and raped her and then kept her in slavery? Isn't it far more likely that she would resent his further pillaging of young, beautiful women from around after she had already been married to him for 4 years? Isn't it far more likely that she would be uncontrollably angry at this man who just signed her entire family and people to genocidal annihilation? Those all seem like more likely situations for this young woman. But it just so happens, coincidentally, that Esther is a woman of humility and grace, and she keeps the king's favor. Third, does this make any sense to you? That Esther would actually make this walk? That Esther would actually go to the king? Doesn't it seem far more likely that she would have found a way to back out of the situation? Let's keep in mind, she has managed to keep her ethnicity and her faith a secret for 5 years and more. No one knows she's a Jew. Even if the edict for annihilation went forward and she didn't do it, and all of the Jews in the region were annihilated, there's no way her adopted stepfather, Mordecai, there's no way he's going to out her. She could have just backed up from this and said, I cannot do this. I'm just going to live my quiet life of luxury. Keep in mind, it's not as if she has a bank of positive experiences behind her. She's been fasting for 3 days and nights. She has no food or drink. She's not in her right head. She's not thinking clearly. No one around her is thinking clearly. Yes, I'm going to go do this. I'm still going to go do this thing where I'm going to face my certain death. What was I supposed to do? Does anyone remember? Oh, right. It seems far more likely she would have found some excuse to back out of the situation. Fourth, Esther's not the kind of woman who used her position carelessly. This kind of goes with that posture thing. She had the king's favor, right? She could have been the kind of young woman who got used to her luxuries and just kind of started to ask for more and more and more. She could have been the kind of woman who vied for the king's attention all of the time. She could have gone to war against the rest of the harem and really annoyed him about it. She could have used him to fight all of her political battles. But coincidentally, she's not that kind of girl. Fifth, why is she going to the king? Does this make any sense to anybody? Up until this chapter, they've been sending messages by eunuch, the eunuch express. You just send a guy along and he sends your message along. Why is she going herself? Wouldn't it be far safer to send a message? There's no risk of death. Especially if she's going to invite Haman, make it pretty, make it a nice invitation. Oh, king, my husband, would you bring your first in command to have a banquet with me? This seems normal. There's no risk. But if she did that, then chapter 6 couldn't happen. And coincidentally, she chooses to go for some odd reason that makes no sense. Coincidence? Oh, there's one more. Xerxes, the king, just happens to be sitting in such a way that he can see her. Because we know from chapter 1, he, and the rest of the book of Esther, he likes beautiful women and he likes to see Queen Esther. He didn't have to accept her. He didn't have to extend the scepter. He just happened to be not busy with anything else at that moment. I mean, there is a war going on, but he's not worried about that at the moment. It just happens to be, you remember from last chapter, that she hasn't seen him for 30 days. If he had just seen her yesterday or that morning or the day before, it's pretty likely he might have said, yeah, I'm kind of busy right now. It's fine, Esther, you're not going to die, but I'll just talk to you later. I just saw you, right? Like, you couldn't ask me this morning? How odd is it that the king is alone and his second in command isn't right there with him, interrupting, blocking, gatekeeping? How weird is it that Haman isn't right there? But coincidentally, he just happens to be sitting there, sees his beautiful queen, and says, oh, my lovely queen, come on over. Coincidence? This is a fun game. Let's go on, verse 4. I don't know how many coincidences you counted there. I had to hack a whole bunch out because I ran out of time, but there's at least 10 in that passage alone. We're going to summarize verses 4 through 8 because, we got to get the whole bunch of chapters here. So, in chapter 5, the rest of chapter 5, what happens is Esther and Xerxes and Haman, they go to her banquet. Xerxes again asks her what he can do for her, and for whatever reason, Esther kind of pauses and hems and haws and delays for no apparent reason and invites both men to another banquet tomorrow. Like, what do you want, Queen Esther? You know what? Let's do this again. It was so much fun. Why don't you come to a banquet again tomorrow, please? Speaking of banquets, for those of you who are at home, we're going to celebrate communion today, so go ahead and grab your bread and your cup materials. There are, you know what, let's play another game. There are at least 10 coincidences in verses 4 through 8. So I will make you, because we're Baptists, I won't make you a bet. I'll make you a bargain. The first one who emails me your list of the 10 coincidences that you can find in verses 4 through 8 of chapter 5, then lunch is on me. And coincidentally, it'll be on Eddie's card and he won't even know it. It'll be fine. Think about this for a second though. That pause, that second banquet moment, I'm fascinated by that moment. I want to know what happened there. Is Esther revealing herself as a master strategist? Or is she just acting on the plans that somehow Mordecai and she talked about during the fasts? Because he later on reveals himself as a master strategist. Or maybe this young woman is just flying by the seat of her royal pants and it just happens coincidentally to all work out. We don't know. But in that moment, in that pause of Queen Esther, up to half my kingdom, I will give it to you. Second time I'm asking. Maybe she kind of feels like, oh, this isn't enough time. I haven't seen him for 30 days yet. I'm not really sure he really wants to do this. I'm just going to pause and wait for another one. I'm just going to do another banquet. Let's do it again. Servants, do it again. Maybe she was strategizing. This is a huge request. She's asking the king to give up billions of dollars to turn over his second. She knows what she's about to ask. Maybe she feels like, oh, this vibe is not quite right yet. I'm just going to do this again. Who knows? Maybe Haman had too much to drink. Maybe the king had too much to drink, or not enough to drink, like whatever reason. She did this weird thing that makes no sense at all, didn't ask, and invites them to another banquet. Luckily, it's going to work out for her. Coincidence? You're lacking enthusiasm in my game here. Verses 9 through 14, let's summarize those too. So after the first banquet, Haman is so full of himself, he goes home with great arrogance, patting himself on the back, that even the most beautiful woman in the land wants to dine with me. And he leaves his banquet so full of himself, and he goes out the city gate, and he sees, the Jew, that guy Mordecai. Mordecai's over there giving him the stink eye, like, I am not bowing. Everyone else is bowing. Haman has the highest of honors. He is wealthy beyond belief. He's got every acclaim in the land, and yet that guy. And he goes home and pats himself on the back, and he starts bragging over dinner to his wife and his friends about all of his riches and all of his successes and how Queen Esther wants to dine with him. But that guy Mordecai is just a burr in his saddle. And so I've never said that phrase before. I don't know where that came from. That's not in my notes. Inspiration from the Holy Spirit. His wife gives him the worst advice ever. I mean, it's pretty good advice, but the way it would play out, coincidentally, is the worst advice ever. She says to her husband, you don't like that guy? We don't like that guy? You should do something about it. Build a pole, a stake, 75 feet high. That's almost 6 stories tall. And impale Mordecai on that pole. And Haman goes, that is a good plan. Let's do that. He builds that pole. It is almost a 6-foot story. How many stories is that? I don't know. It's 6 stories high, that pole is. What they're doing is they're saying to all the Jews and everyone in the land, look what we did to the most powerful of you. If we can put Mordecai on that pole, all of you should run, is what they are trying to say. We move into chapter 6. Let's move to chapter 6. Chapter 6. Remember when Esther paused and offered a second banquet? There's no way this was strategized. There's just no way. It just happens to be that night Xerxes can't sleep. He's had a banquet. He's got a full belly. He's had some wine. But for some reason, the king can't sleep that night. So instead of choosing beautiful harp music, instead of having beautiful bells music, instead of having warm milk, he chooses to have his official record of his day read to him to help him sleep. And it just so happens to be coincidentally that the eunuch reading the passage, just chooses, flipping through. I don't know, let's choose this one. Hey, this is the story of Mordecai rescuing you, king, from the plot from Bigthana and Teresh. Coincidentally, just happened to land on that passage. King Xerxes just happens to remember, you know what? I don't think we ever did reward that guy. What did we do for him? Nothing, Your Honor. Oh, let's do something about that. So, the next morning, the king wakes up. He's intent on honoring Mordecai. Haman, full of himself, comes in with all these plans to ask permission. Can I put Mordecai on that stake? And the king asks, hey, I want to honor my favorite man in the land. And Haman's like, well, okay, go ahead then, sure. And he outlines this incredible plan of honor and great esteem and rewards and whatever. And the king says, that's a great plan, Haman. You should do that for Mordecai. And in fact, Haman, you should be the one that goes in front, like all that. You should be the one that publicly proclaims his honor. Go ahead and do that. That was a great plan. Good job, Haman. Yes, Your Honor. And so Haman's got to go out into the street and proclaim the greatness of Mordecai throughout the streets. He's got to award and reward Mordecai, his death enemy, throughout the streets. Meanwhile, he's still got this pole that he was like, this is not going to go well for me. Coincidentally, he goes home and prepares for the second banquet, which, by the way, is the same day. It's an exhausting day for Haman. He had plans to murder someone, put him up on a big pole. He got turned around. He had to go through the streets and proclaim honor. Now he's got this big banquet with the queen again. Okay, so he's got to gear up for this. Chapter 7. Let's slow this down and look at this a little more in-depthly. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, my favorite, my queen, my love, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. And Queen Esther answered. You can imagine her taking a deep breath. If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. You can imagine a pause, and the king looks at Haman, and I don't know, this is weird. What is she talking about? Grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Which coincidentally just happens to be the exact same wording of the edict that Haman wrote. If we had been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes, in horror, looks at Queen Esther. Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. At this point, the camera zooms in. Everyone turns to look at Haman. There is deathly silence in the air. Esther maybe even stands and says, an adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman. She sits down. If you look at this, go back to verse 1, 7, whatever this is. Go back to the beginning of this passage. I want to call out a bunch of coincidences here, but I think that's not fair. I honestly, at this point, think that Esther's character can't have been anything but humble and strategic and self-controlled here. I try to think about all the other ways that she could have played it, and I just can't come up with anything. It just seems like this is who she is. And so I want to say to me, and I want to say to you, that part of stepping forward in faith requires trusting in the gifts and the abilities and the personality that he gave you. To echo last week's chapter, you are perfectly suited for that moment, for such a time as this. In this second banquet, coincidentally, because it didn't have to happen this way, Xerxes acts again to bless Esther, which is a little weird because the king doesn't repeat himself, especially to his queen. He could have forgotten about it. He's got Haman talking his ear off about something about a pole. He's got stuff going on over here, but he ignores all that and he focuses on his queen and asks again, which, no pun intended, thank God he did. If he didn't ask her, there's no way she can bring it up. If he didn't open that door for her to make the request, she can't make she can't, there's no protocol for that. There's no way she can do that. It just happens to be he opens the door again. Third time in 2 days. She has somehow managed to build up the perfect amount of suspense to draw him in. And when she says what she says, I don't know if this was strategy. I don't know if Mordecai wrote this out for her or this is just her character, but for whatever reason, she happens to choose the passive voice. It's a way to pull the king in even further. She's not straight up accusing. She's not saying, you did this. She's not saying that. She's saying, well, it's kind of like this is happening to me, and so maybe you can... She's appealing to his desire to help her. And if you look at her phrase, she's so careful. She's so careful to make it sound like Haman is the king's adversary and enemy. Really, it's both of them, but you can't really call the king out. That's just not good. That's not good strategy. Here's my favorite coincidence that I thought of. What in the world is Haman doing in this moment? He is the second in command. This guy is a sharp man. This is all happening, and he hasn't figured out what's happening yet. He hasn't put together, for some reason, that his enemy, Mordecai, just happens to be the queen's father. He hasn't figured out they're related. He hasn't put together that Jew, and she must be a Jew. I never really thought about that. Interesting. He hasn't put together what's happening when she called out his exact wording in his edict. He didn't knock over. Come on. If this is you, you're knocking over wine. Oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry. You're running out. You're like, a bathroom break, gotta go. You're doing anything you can to get out of that room. Haman just sits there until she can point the finger at him. Coincidence? Verse 7. The king gets up in a rage. He leaves his wine and he goes out to, which is a big thing. He leaves his wine and he goes out to the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, he stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life, which was a huge mistake. Verse 8. As the king returns from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was in the act of falling on the couch where Esther was reclining to beg for his life, to beg for forgiveness, something, but he's going to fall on this couch to beg. And the king exclaims, he gets the wrong idea. He's like, is this guy going to molest the queen while she's here with me in my presence? And as soon as the word leaves, Haman's guilt crosses his face. Here's my favorite part. This is my favorite part of the whole thing. Verse 9. Verse 9, this is awesome. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, just happened to mention, by the way, king, a pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits happens to stand by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, the guy you honored, who spoke up to help you. What's Harbona doing? He's got no business in talking. He's a eunuch. No one asked him anything. He's just going to step in this moment. Oh, by the way, king, just so you know, there's a pole over there. Haman was intending it for evil. I'm just mentioning it. I don't know. And maybe even further. Harbona, if you remember from chapter 1, is one of the king's 7 eunuchs. This guy is no slouch. This guy has a sharp political mind as well. When he says this, he's almost implying the plot to kill you, king. Mordecai was the one that found that out. Haman wants to kill Mordecai. In other words, Haman's in on the plot to kill you. Not a stretch for a second in command to consider how to do this. Harbona, as a genius, just happens to mention at the right time. Oh, I wonder what that pole is for. Gosh. Okay. What is the point of this book being in the Bible? For the Jews, even today, they annually celebrate God's deliverance in the book of Esther during Purim. For those of us who are not Jews, we are called Gentiles. I think this book of Esther functions as both an apologetic, a defense of God's presence in the world, and I think it works as a tool for evangelism. I think it proves God's imminent presence. Imminent with an A, not his soon-to-be happening, but his imminent, his right here, his tangible, his touchable presence. I think Esther, is Esther a cosmic and logical defense of God's presence? No. But it is a proof text for God's reality inside Mordecai's life, inside Esther's life, inside everyone around them, and by proxy, inside our lives. The old ways of talking about God from a logical point of view, from an apologetic point of view. Sure, we can do that for fun and for discourse and for our own growth, but does that work in any way to be appealing? Not for this generation. They just need to hear an undeniable story that God is real. Tell me that what I'm worshiping, tell me that what I'm spending my time on, tell me that what I'm hearing about, seeing, tell me that there is some real thing happening. So yes, you could read the Bible, you could read Esther. If you are a mocker or a scorner, you could read Esther as a simple fairy tale. You could read it as a work of fiction. But for those of us who have ears to hear and eyes to see, God is real, and God is talking to us. I think these coincidences, so many, piling up, they are not unique to the book of Esther. I think that once we begin to discover these coincidences in our own life, I wonder, I haven't been able to, I'm going to step away from pulpit because this is just me now. I haven't found anyone else to back this up, but I think if we can develop this skill of looking at our life and finding these stacks of undeniable coincidences, I think they can function as the new evangelism. I think if I love my friend and they love me and we're talking about real things in our life and I say, hey, listen, I can't answer all your questions and all your doubts about God because frankly, some of them are mine too, but I do have the story that I can't get rid of. There's this thing that happened to me and it just happened this way, and coincidentally that, and then it just happened this way, and I don't know why, but this happened, and it just goes on, and what do you do with that? There's no such thing as coincidence in God's vocabulary. What do I do with this story? Maybe I have doubts about God. Maybe I have challenges about God, but there's this thing in my life, and if I do it enough, I've got 3 stories, 5 stories. I've got 10 stories of things that just happened to me, and I don't know how to explain them. There must be a God. And if I love my friend enough, and I'm close enough to them, my friend, let's talk about this thing that just happened to you. Do you really think that was just coincidence? It's not fair to challenge you without revealing my own. So here's one of my coincidence stories. I didn't choose this. I was born into an Asian American family, and my parents designated the careers for each one of us. And I grew up knowing that I was supposed to be a surgeon. So I went to college knowing that I had all these hard sciences, and I am a little lazy by nature, so I just wanted to do fun things, and so I just wanted to read fun books. And if I had to write papers about them, then so be it. So I went to be a little bit different. I was attempting to go to med school as an English major. As an English major, they just taught you how to read stuff, to look behind the text, and write stuff about it. Coincidence? The college I went to, they had a parachurch ministry group called InterVarsity, and I really liked that group. So I went to that campus group, and their InterVarsity at that time was known for a particular Bible study method called the inductive Bible study. It's a way of just looking behind the text and asking questions and trying to see what God is doing behind the text. Coincidence? Eventually, I heard God call me to a different path than medicine. Oh, thank God. Because that was not going to go well. And so I went to seminary, and I fell in love with student ministry. Students who couldn't care a whole lot about what the Bible actually says. They just want to talk about why they don't like the Bible and they don't like God, and they want to talk about challenges too, and they want to see behind the text of what God is really doing and why he would really do that. And why would he say that? Well, funny enough, that's kind of my training. I ended up at Pathways, and I've told the story, Sonia and I have told the story about how we ended up here. I don't know when it was, it's a sermon from somewhere before. But that's a whole bank of coincidences as to how we ended up here. And when I get here, it just so happens that some people, Pastors Paula and Eddie, are not okay with a student ministry pastor just doing student ministry. No, Jonathan, you've got to take your turn preaching too. Coincidentally, I find that I quite like being with you all, exploring Scripture together. But in all honesty, I didn't know that I would like it. I'm a little famous among youth ministry circles for bagging on the Sunday preacher. So you and I are here in this moment through a series of likely and unlikely random happenstance. Coincidence? Your turn. How can you learn to see the coincidences in your own daily lives? I wrote up a little exercise. I put them in the discussion prompts. You have it in your email. The link is in the YouVersion app. And if you're not on either one of those two, then I made a cool little QR code. You can grab it now. It's an exercise, I think, that I started with to help me see the coincidences in my own life. I hope you will take this challenge to engage, to see God talking to you through the events of your daily life. Your own burning bush is the stuff that happens to you every day. Your pillar of fire is the happenstance that occurs to you every day. If you need a little help, coincidentally, Sandra's devotional book is all about unseen women who are doing these amazing things and saving lives even though they go unseen and unknown. It's not like we planned this. She just happened to finish this at the right time for this message. It's almost as if there's a divine being in charge of our schedule. So, dream with me a little bit. What if? What if a few of us went home and debunked our own coincidence stories? When Sonia and we do it to each other, when we're a little low or whatever, we remind ourselves of the coincidences and how God is present, and it boosts us up. What if a few of us were able to do that? What if a few of us had that personal joy of like, I have a story about God that no one can deny? What would that do to your own worship, to your own celebration? If 5 of us had it, if 10 of us had that experience, would the rest of us be able to feel that? Would it somehow transform our worship? If Ananda or Carol, the worship team, was like, hey, think about your coincidence, and you are filled with joy, and then that's gotta be transformative. What would it do to our evangelism as a church? All of a sudden, you don't have time to talk to anybody because you're trying to meet everyone's friends. Because this person brought someone, and this person brought someone, and this person brought someone, and that person brought someone, and we're all just trying to share our stories with them. And that person's like, okay, I get it. God is real. I get it. What if we had so many stories, and you agreed to record them, that we had a page full of them on our website, that our YouTube channel was filled with stories? It's not ontological proofs of God. They're not apologetic defense of God's existence. They are, this is my story. This happened to me, and I can't explain it, but I worship God because of it. None of that happens without you. Will you join us in this journey? There is no such thing as coincidence. God is everywhere. God is talking to us. God is talking to you. Coincidentally, speaking of meals and speaking of remembering God's deliverance, we have our own today. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, then we welcome you to participate in today's communion. If you are not yet sure about following Jesus, well then first of all, we invite you to explore that with one of us. Talk to one of us about what that might look like, what that might be of your life and how it might change your life to consider following Jesus. So if you are not yet sure about following Jesus, then we would just ask that you refrain from taking part of the communion. There's a verse in Scripture that says that you will eat and drink judgment upon yourself. So we don't want that for you. You can just observe the holy moment with us. So this is the time when you peel off that awkward plastic off the top of these things. I'm going to do a new thing. Every time I lead communion, we're going to have like real bread and soda or fruit punch or something. We're going to bless it and make it holy. All right. In the Luke passage, Luke 22, it records that on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Let's partake of the bread. In the same way, imagine Jesus sitting at this table with his disciples, and him knowing what is about to happen, knowing what he's about to go through, and filled with love for his people. He takes the cup and he says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you."